Recording.
We are recording. Perfect. We're doing it, Josh. Podcast
That's right.
number one.
Podcasting number one.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna call this podcast Small Lake City to just keep it original, small
Cute.
Lake City.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you being first guest.
No problem.
Is this your first guest appearance on any podcast?
No, actually, it's not.
Wow.
I've been on a podcast before. Yeah.
What
I don't
the-
remember what it was called.
What were you talking about? Why
we
were
were
you on
talking
this
about
podcast?
an art, like film festival,
Okay.
mental health film festival,
Okay.
a couple years ago. Before everything shut down.
Yeah.
So
So they were just talking to you about
Yeah.
what you were doing, what films you were working on, all that.
well, yeah,
rah-rah.
like well, then it was called something different, but what is now Mental Healthy Fit, Mental
Okay.
Healthy FIT, back then was Create Real Change, and so they just brought two of us on to talk to about stuff. The two of us meaning Brian and me,
Okay,
Who are
you and Brian, yeah.
the two people.
So that was your first and last one, and so this is your second
This is my second podcast.
and second one. I
Yes.
guess.
Very exciting.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Good.
Yeah. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about why I wanted to do podcasting and why I thought it was important to involve a community voice. So you're the first person in the community,
Great.
and with that, I think you're maybe not native to this community. You've come to the community. How long ago did you come to the community, Salt Lake City?
I moved here in 2005.
Okay, so it's
So-
quite a while.
It's been a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm always interested why, from a person growing up in Utah, knowing the culture of Utah, why would one choose to come to Utah?
Well, I got my undergrad in the same state that I grew up in, which is Missouri. Was only like 3 hours away. And so, long enough to be distant from the family, but close enough at the same time.
Yeah,
And then I had a
yeah.
lot of other friends who went completely out of state, and I saw how that, shifted their perceptions and things of that nature. So when I decided to get a master's degree, I only applied to schools that were relatively far away from St. Louis.
Gotcha.
And I got into 3, and then Utah was the smallest school, which meant that I probably had the better chance at getting some more teaching experience
Okay.
within the program. Because
Yeah.
if you have a program that has, 20 different people, then
For
a little
sure.
hard. But if each cohort is 3 or 4, there's a little bit more opportunity to, really engage.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So that's how I ended up in Utah. I was only going to be here for 3 years. And again, that was 2005. So
At the University of Utah.
at the University of Utah, yes.
Master's in.
In film, so Masters of Fine Arts.
Okay. And so you completed that master's, and from there you were like, kind of like this place.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that kind of,
Yeah.
you settle in a place, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah.
But, recently my wife has been looking for other jobs and stuff. And whenever we think about going out of state, we both get a little sad about it. So I
Yeah.
think we've settled into the point where this is definitely both of our adopted homes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard many people say that. And I mean, like I said, I grew up here. So I think about the reasons why maybe I'd want to go have a different experience. And yeah, there are reasons, but I really haven't found like this huge thing that would pull me away from Utah. And maybe that's just my bias. Maybe that's part of like, hey, I grew up here, it's safe. I have my family, my friends. Going somewhere else would take away that sort of safety net, that comfort,
Yeah, and I think it gets harder the older you get as
Yeah,
well, right?
for sure.
I came here, what would I have been, 22, 23, something like
Okay.
that. So, you're still
Yeah.
relatively young at that point.
Yeah.
Now, starting over in a new city would be pretty daunting for me.
Right. Yeah. It was for sure. Yeah. That's a great point. Like thinking about the age I am now and having to redevelop a social circle and get involved in different things in the community is just like, wow, I don't have the energy to do that. Like I'm here, I'm established, I have connections. It's easy to get involved in the community, but going somewhere else, it does feel pretty daunting.
Yeah, and those connections are a major part.
For
right? Especially because, small Lake City,
Yeah.
it is big enough to have a lot of access to a lot of different things,
For
but
sure.
it's also small enough that, you don't get as lost in the fray when you're trying to do things. So you really can be a part of multiple communities in a city that's this size. Now, is that going to change as more people move in? Probably a
Yeah.
little bit. But I have family who live in much bigger cities,
Mm.
and you really do get in your little clique or your little zone or your little neighborhood. And I haven't experienced that as much
Right.
in Salt Lake as I have in lots of other places.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear because I've kind of wondered about that. It seems like Salt Lake might be at that cusp of maybe growing to that point where it's bigger than feeling like Small Lake City, bigger to the point where like you're not as connected. We're not 1 degree of separation from each other, sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah, part of me hopes it does grow a little bit, but then the other part of me is like, it's nice where it's at.
Well,
right
there's
now.
definitely been some good growth
Yeah.
since I've been here, in many cultural and social spheres. It definitely feels much less like an isolated city than it did when I first moved here.
Yeah, then
So-
I actually want you to talk more about that. Like, what was it like? Like, you decided as University of Utah because it was a smaller program or whatever. But then I'm sure there's these thoughts of like, I'm going to Salt Lake City. This place is maybe I don't know. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't know that much about Salt Lake City.
Okay, all right.
I mean, the same things that everybody else thinks about when they think of Salt
Sure.
Lake City. Is it a ridiculously conservative place? Is it nothing but people from the church? Those were concerns,
Right.
I suppose. But didn't really end up being that.
Okay. Yeah, I was
As
gonna.
much?
Were those concerns validated when you got here? Did you feel that?
On occasion.
Okay.
On occasion. I only tried to get converted a few times.
Well, that's
Which
low.
was
Yeah.
weird because, like, where I'm from, I don't think I even know hardly any of my friends' religions they grew up in. That's not like a topic
Interesting.
of conversation,
For
really.
sure. Yeah.
Unless you go to the same church with somebody, they don't talk about it.
Right.
So nobody had ever asked me, like, what's your religion until
Yeah.
I moved here.
Yeah, which is weird because my experience growing up here, and I grew up south of Salt Lake in Orem, which is probably even more conservative and more Mormon, more white, more whatever. And it was like there's two types of people: member of the church, or as the Mormons call it, the non-members of the church.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. You've maybe felt that to a certain level, but maybe you said not as much as you thought you would.
I think when I first moved here, I mean, I also work in the arts, so that
Okay,
that changes your
Yeah.
who you come in contact with.
Yeah,
I think,
less
especially
conservative. Yeah.
especially in a city that has such a strong, influence, shall we
Right.
say?
Yeah.
That subculture has been a major part of Salt Lake for a very long time.
Yeah.
Everybody knows about the punk scene in the '80s.
Right.
I always tell people in my classes that I teach that I've never been in a city that has as many decent tattoo shops per capita.
Yeah.
Just drive up and down State Street.
That's true. That's
Like-
I hadn't thought about it that way.
It's ridiculous how many tattoo shops there are. And that's all a reflection of this dominant culture and then the subculture.
Right.
And so the subculture is obviously anything that isn't super conservative.
Yeah.
And anybody who spends a considerable amount of time in Salt Lake, at least not under that shadow of the church,
Sure.
going to festivals, things of that nature,
Right.
whatever's going on. It's pretty apparent that sort of disconnect between Salt Lake City and what's going on the top of the hill, which is very interesting.
Yeah, there is that interesting connection to like top of the hill, the Mormon church, very conservative, and then like you said, this subculture, counterculture sort of vibe. So I'm, going back to like when you first got here and you felt that sort of people trying to convert you a little bit. Like, what was that like?
I mean, it was, somewhat invasive, I suppose. It was really funny to me because there are 3 times that it really happened. One was a friend of mine who was in some classes, and then she was going to go do her mission, and she needed to practice on somebody. So,
Okay.
you can practice, it's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
It's like, it's not going to work, but you can practice. And then she showed up with somebody else. It's like, hold on, I feel like this is a trap. That was like the most awkward one.
Yeah.
And then I was acting in a really weird movie where I'd shaved my head and I had like a big old goatee and I have a very mean looking bald head.
Okay.
So I looked like somebody who just got out of like prison.
Mm.
And I was wearing a wife beater, watching a parade, and I think it was like the July 24th,
Okay.
Pioneer Day.
Yeah.
I was just outside of my apartment watching the parade, and that's the day someone decided they wanted to convert me.
Oh.
Like, what about this guy?
Yeah.
Makes you think, yeah, he's the one.
It's Pioneer Day, man.
Yeah, it's
We gotta-
Pioneer Day, I guess.
True to our heritage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was one other time that wasn't really that exciting. So
Yeah, interesting. So, a couple of words stuck out to me, like feeling trapped a little bit. Like, I've been a Mormon missionary. I was former Mormon, so I get this sort of idea where like maybe you tell somebody enough to get into their door to sit across from them to hopefully tell them more and get them excited or interested about it. But I think it does often create this feeling of trapped or like taken advantage of. So it sounds like maybe you experienced that to a certain level, and maybe that was a microcosm of what's happening in the larger community at some level.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that. I know a lot of people who have converted
Sure.
because they're expected to,
Mm.
not necessarily
Yeah.
because there's actually any belief systems there.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and I grew up as a dogmatically Catholic person, and I knew people in the Catholic Church were the same way, right?
Right.
You know, oh, well, I'll go because it's expected. Oh, it's my family, that kind
Yeah.
of thing. But there weren't that many people who got converted, and I think that's the interesting part.
Right.
Is that there are, this movement to try to pull more people into the church. And you can easily go into, some of the sketchier ways that has happened in the past. But
Yeah, there's plenty of those.
That's not
Yeah.
my department
Yeah,
necessarily.
maybe that's
For another day.
Next,
Let a
yeah.
historian talk about it. I'm just
next session.
yeah, I just like history, but I'm not a history teacher. So
Yeah, there's been, I think that not only in the Mormon church, but several other religions that go about it in these weird sort of ways. But the like conversion versus just joining the community is this interesting idea, because I think the church and its members would like to think that they've really converted somebody, they really believe. But a lot of people are joining for several other reasons, and some of it is just this sheer pressure of like, hey, if you're going to be in our community, it'd be better if you were Mormon sort of feeling.
right, and then access.
Mm,
Right, access is a major thing.
Right.
To a lot of different services.
right.
Yeah, the whole idea of separation of church and state doesn't really exist here so much. Again, especially considering where I came from and
Right.
seeing how they are actually different entities
Yeah, yeah.
and multiples, not just one.
Right.
So a lot of the people I know that call themselves Mormon but are not, it's because of access to something, whether it's access to different resources or different doors that get opened
Right.
or opportunities or what have you. Clearly you know about that from your
Yeah.
days serving refugees.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of people in refugee communities who go to church, but not because it's actually something they believe in, but it opens the door to a lot of other community resources that shouldn't be tied to religion, but are.
Right.
They're not,
Right.
quote unquote, but they
Yeah.
also are.
Yeah.
It's this interesting give and take kind of thing.
Yeah, and it can get very complicated and complex if you go down one of those avenues and try to parse that all and, pick it apart a little bit. And like you said, we could probably spend hours talking about just those sort of factors, but they're definitely there. And yeah, the church and maybe its members take advantage of them. Some probably consciously, some probably subconsciously.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing about faith is if you truly believe what you believe is it, and part of that is converting other people, then can you fault somebody for doing that? But then also, if somebody's 18 years old, have they really figured out anything in life?
Yeah.
I'm still figuring stuff out.
I
And
know,
I plan to for the rest of my life.
For sure. Yeah.
And I am very far away from 18
For
at
sure.
this point. I would really laugh myself off the stoop if 18-year-old me showed up and tried to teach me now about anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm totally with you. Like thinking back when I was 18, thinking I knew things was like, wow, that's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. So that's really where, and again, coming from Catholic, you look at history, Catholics were far worse
Yeah.
than the majority of religions as far as their conversion tactics.
Yeah.
But there's that weird little, you're sending out people who are innocent or naive enough to just tout the line
Right.
without actually giving them any real life experience first. So
Right.
it's interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why they do that, right?
Yeah.
And there's probably, some various reasons, but one of them might be that I don't know enough, so I'm just going to go do what I'm told,
Yeah,
sort of thing.
it's much easier to get people to do, again, tout the line.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Going back to, though, like your comparison of growing up in St. Louis or Missouri in general, and you being able to clearly see a separation between church and state. Obviously, me growing up here, I don't see that. I don't know what that's like. What is that like?
Well, I'll give you a really good example. Again, grew up Catholic, but didn't go to Catholic school, so I went to public school. There was no school across the street that I could take an hour out of public school to go to.
Okay.
That's a no-no. That's
Yeah.
Well, that was one of the weirdest things when I moved here. I was like, wait, so they're going across the street to learn about religion even though they're in public school? That's like what public school is.
No, Josh, it's off property, man.
Is you
It's all
don't,
good.
yeah, it's off property, exactly. That's not a thing.
Okay.
I had to go to Catholic school, quote unquote, but I went on Monday nights for 8
Okay.
years. That was a good old time, I tell you. I'd love those days back. But it wasn't during school.
Right.
And so that's one of those really obvious signs of how that connection isn't there.
Yeah.
Now, am I saying that religion doesn't influence politics in Missouri? No, of course not. We have a lot of conservatives. We have a lot of evangelicals around. We have a lot of those things, but it's not necessarily as definable as one, per se. And there are
Gotcha.
definitely other religions, like
Right.
if you are Muslim in St. Louis, you are not afforded as many opportunities as you would be if you were some sect of Christianity.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know. So I'm not saying, it's really good and I moved to this. That's not it.
Yeah.
But I think it's more complicated, which is interesting because there's a greater, influx of different influences.
Right. And people may be challenging different beliefs and sets of beliefs and getting their opinion out there. Whereas here, it's changing, but here it's like it's the church's opinion or the church's push versus everybody else that might not agree with the church or be conservative in that sort of standpoint.
And I think, obviously the history of Utah really plays into that. And a lot of people who live here don't know the history of Utah very much.
Yeah.
They just know that,
Yeah.
the story that is told, not necessarily
Right.
the actual history and how it has always been a pretty complicated place.
Right.
But the people in charge throughout the entire history of Utah have been
Right.
members of the church. And so that narrative that is crafted comes from the church, even though there have been a lot of people who have not been associated with the church since the 1800s, since the 1850s in this city, but they're not the ones who we actually talk about.
Right.
And that happens in any city that is founded by one particular group of people that they write the history.
For sure.
And they choose whose stories not to tell and whose stories to tell. So,
Yeah.
But Utah is a relatively newer place. If you go to the east side of the country, there's more history there. There's longer history. There's more complex migration stories and things of that nature going on. And so I think that's one of the reasons why growing up it wasn't a thing that I noticed as much because the city I'm from, it's been something there since 1600s-ish.
Yeah.
It was a little trading town, and then it grew, and then there's all these different communities that came in, and it was a major hub for a long time.
Sure.
Utah was, you either basically were Mormon or were willing to live with the Mormons, or you were just passing through
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I have noticed more lately that there are people bringing to light these historical events or people in history in Utah that were not associated with the Mormon church. And it is very interesting to hear, to know about. Yeah, of course, we had brothels downtown Salt Lake and all these other things that maybe the church didn't want there in a public sort of eye, but perhaps even people in the church participated in. Yeah.
Wildest city in the West apparently was in Utah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't remember what it was now. Oh, what was the name of that town? It's going to drive me nuts. I'll remember as soon as we stop recording.
Yeah. I don't know, but yeah.
But yeah, that period is fascinating.
Right.
And it would be really nice if we claimed it as a
Right.
state.
Yeah.
It is a much more complex history than we talk about.
Right. Yeah.
And again, I'm not a history teacher, but I was raised by a weird history nut. And so I've always read history. And when I was moving to another state, I read a bunch of Utah history. So I probably know more than the majority of people who live here. Just because, I read other sources, not just was taught the state lore.
Right.
And the same thing could be said. I'm sure, if somebody moves to Missouri and reads history about that, there's a lot of things that they would discover that I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And yeah, we could go on about this in any city, right? But there's this particular interest and focus for us here in Salt Lake City and why it is this way. What are the factors that have come to influence it, and what are the factors that come to tell the history? Like, are we just going to tell this part of our history, or are we going to be okay like saying these other things that have really influenced who we are as well, but we don't want to acknowledge? I think that is, of course, a theme for the church and Utah in general. Is like there are these historical things, we just don't want to acknowledge them. That happens to probably to all groups, but yeah, it's curious for me to like listen to hear what you have to say about St. Louis and other places to see if those factors are at play there, or if there's this certain sort of piece of the Mormon Church and their influence and the power that they have, to see if they are pushing a little bit harder to maintain some of that power within the city and the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at a lot of social issues and how they are conversed about within Utah as a whole, but then what is actually done with that information in the legislature, you definitely see that the legislature is many years behind culturally where Utah is moving. Yes, there's still very conservative pockets of Utah,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah.
But the legislators do not really represent the overall state, especially over the last 5-10 years.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
And moving forward, it's going to continually be this interesting thing to watch.
Yeah.
Because to be bipartisan on a committee in Utah means you have one Democrat and like 8 Republicans.
Yeah.
You know, and super conservative Republicans.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen some conversations like, oh, we're relatively bipartisan, and they're all Republicans, but one of them is moderate. That's not bipartisan, you know?
Right.
And so it's. I think that is really where I see that major influence. It's not so much in the city anymore. I mean, yes, you could talk alcohol laws, you could talk all sorts of things like that. That it obviously does have an impact.
Yeah.
And for being a tourist economy to also have this
Mm.
weird alcohol laws, those two things are.
Yeah.
They don't mesh well.
Right.
You know? That's part of tourism.
Yeah.
If tourists drink, they spend more money.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah.
And from where I'm from, a conservative drinks more than a liberal person. So moving to Utah, that's a weird thing.
Yeah, that is a little bit of a mind bender to like to think about it that way. Another thing you mentioned about like Missouri and maybe the comparison, especially in its history, is how Missouri's been a place where lots of different people have traveled through or made home there for a period of time. Diversity at certain levels. Talk to me about like what's the difference in diversity that you experienced in St. Louis versus here, and how maybe that diversity was acknowledged in the community.
Well, it's actually really interesting because, you know, when I first moved here, all I saw was white people because I was basically living downtown and I was taking the tracks up to the university and back, and that's it. I didn't go to those other neighborhoods where, because we do live in a city that has different sides of the tracks,
Yeah.
you know, very much so.
Yeah.
And I come from a city like that too,
Huh.
right? I came from a city that had segregation, and the middle school I went to was built as the black high school. And, you know, you didn't see a lot of migration across those lines, still racially in St.
Yeah.
Louis. And so I'm not going to say that St. Louis is this like bastion of diverse thinking, because it is not.
Sure.
I mean, if you've been paying attention to national news for the last, well, forever, St. Louis is not a
Yeah.
beacon on the hill.
Yeah, they had some bad rap a few years there, right?
For anything. And so when I first moved here, I was like, oh, well, where I come from is way more diverse than this. But it really isn't. Like, Salt Lake is wildly diverse,
Yeah,
but you have to get outside of your neighborhood.
sure.
And that's shifted a little bit. But, like, the first time I brought my wife to St. Louis, I was like, oh, St. Louis is way more diverse. And then she was like, okay, cool. And then we were walking around, she's like, no, it's not. You just have white people and black people. I don't see hardly any, like, Latino people. I don't see a lot of Asian people. It's just white and black, and that's
Sure.
it. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, you're right. What I meant by diverse, I guess, was less white people proportionally, which is not diversity.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, Salt Lake is a pretty diverse place, but it's really good at not recognizing that diversity, I think.
Which is weird. Like, why would we not want to recognize it? Especially if you kind of work through this backwards framework from a church's perspective, where literally my understanding and my participating in the church was that the church would like every single person on this planet to join. They don't care what you look like. But then there's this sort of weird sort of like thing where like, I don't know, do we really want to promote diversity in the city, in the state, and bring people from diverse backgrounds? There's this weird sort of political, religious friction.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you diversify populations, you also diversify mindsets and you diversify opinions. And nothing is more terrifying for the people who benefit from the status quo than any shift in public thought.
Yeah.
So it's that's why a lot of efforts that you see for diversity end up being very performative, and even among very liberal organizations, like you look at university or something like that, right? It's known as being a pretty liberal thing, or some of the arts organizations. There's a particularly large film festival around here that on the surface is super diverse. They have lots of programs that try to bring in different types of filmmakers and from different races and different backgrounds. But the types of work that are allowed in or are not allowed in are not really that diverse when you look at it. They're still like check boxes.
Yeah, I never thought
so,
about it that way.
I mean, I think a lot of times when we talk about diversity, we think of it as like a liberal issue versus a conservative issue, and it's not really. It's not your political leanings that really determine diversity. It's how terrified are you of people who don't look like you, or who don't have the same background as you, or who don't think the same things as you.
Right.
Obviously, some of those people should be. There's a lot of people who look like me that I'm far more terrified of than somebody who comes from a completely different place.
Sure.
Statistically, that's the way it should be.
Sure.
If I see a white dude walk into a restaurant, or a store, I should be far more frightened of that guy than somebody in a hijab.
Yeah.
Or a black man.
Right.
Statistically speaking, I'm much more likely to
Very true.
suffer from that white dude. But
Yeah.
that's not the way we
Right.
think.
Yeah. And it is sort of this weird thing where we are all now trained to think black or white, like either left or right, either liberal or conservative. There's not a lot of room for in the middle sort of thing. And, people are even getting to the point where they're like, okay, I identify as a conservative. So that means I don't like diversity or accept diversity, or I identify as a liberal. So that means I'm going to celebrate diversity the best I can. Where, like, why are we already getting to this point where it has to be so black and white about everything?
Well, we like to simplify, We like to
that's true.
categorize. We like to simplify. It's either good or it's bad, or it's something I should do or shouldn't do. We don't like to really reflect how complicated everything is.
Sure.
Because that leads to anxiety attacks.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. Yeah, I think to some sort of survival perspective, our brain likes to put things in categories and compartments and make it simple so that we can simply survive in the world that we live in.
Yeah, and it's interesting, from a technological perspective as well. Because it used to be that if you lived in an inner city or in a big city, then you had a much more open mindset. That doesn't mean everybody was.
Sure.
But because you had this zone where you actually ran into other people and other things that were going on, even if you tried to avoid it, there were people that didn't look like you, that didn't come from backgrounds that you would have some interactions with, right? And so that's why, but if you're from a little town, you don't. It's just the people who grew up there. They probably all look the same or come from similar backgrounds or are an outsider who is treated as such, right? And so that's why, historically speaking, within big urban centers, you have more liberal thought and liberal politics. And then in more rural areas, you have more conservative, because the theory is, the more people you meet, the more open-minded you kind of have to become.
Yeah.
As long as you're humanizing the people that you meet and realize that everybody's story is different, complicated, and just because something isn't your experience doesn't mean it's not a valid experience. It's a very hard thing for us to understand.
Right.
I mean, how many times have you been in a conversation with somebody like, "Oh, this is the," like, "Wow, that's not my experience." I'm like, okay, it doesn't matter if it's not your experience. If thousands of people are telling you this is a thing, probably a thing. They're not all out to fool you. But I think we're starting to see a little bit of a reversal of that, because technology now, especially with algorithms that just say, "Oh, you liked this thing? Let me find a whole bunch of other things like that," and we get pulled down into these little, sub communities.
Right.
that aren't necessarily based on on geography anymore. It's
Right.
based on whatever you are willing to like and
Yeah.
what you consume. And so, as a media practitioner, I see both the value of media and the horrible, horrible consequences
Right.
of media. And I think this polarization that we see, we've been talking politically, but it could be anything. It could be
Yeah.
religious polarization. It could be, toxically masculine ideas, anything. If you want to find people who believe whatever the hell it is you believe, you'll find those people.
Yeah.
And more people will find you, and more people will find them. And so you have this reversal effect now where it doesn't really matter necessarily where you live. I think you can live in your own little closed world
Yeah.
because you have a community there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I've ever thought about it at that level, but it completely makes sense that, if you dive into your device and you're just clicking on things or viewing things that you like, and then the algorithm's going to give you more and more of that, and then you're quickly pretty spiraled to just viewing and participating in that community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why you have to fool your algorithms.
Yeah. Well,
Occasionally look at something or like something that you really don't like.
right.
Well, the computer doesn't know what the hell to do with you.
And I think it's also good just in terms of your own brain algorithm, right? To view and participate in things that you might not agree with or think are weird or think are not something you like, just so that you get out there, see what else is out there, see what else, why is this person like this or experiencing this?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's beneficial
Yeah.
to a point.
Yeah.
Obviously you can't know everything, learn everything, be
Yeah.
exposed to everything, but
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, from my personal experience, I only experienced a shift in the way I thought or viewed people by experiencing it, right? Going out, meeting different people, participating in different things, traveling the world a little bit. That's the only way that my perspectives shifted. And if somebody went and experienced the exact same things I did in terms of school, travel, whatever else, that doesn't mean they're going to come out and have the exact same perspectives as me. But it was interesting for me to experience that, to like experience these shifts because I had experienced something different.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
again, that's how I end up in Utah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's different?
Yeah.
I'll go there.
which is awesome. You kind of started to tie back into kind of what your topic of interest, your study, your schooling is, media, film. Talk to me about where you're going now. You finished your master's degree. You're working on a PhD.
Yeah.
Well,
There's a little gap in between those two things.
which is probably good for
yeah, it
that
has
old
been
mental
good.
health and everything
Yeah.
else.
Well, and also for, like you were saying, different experiences.
Mm.
If I'd gone and gotten a PhD immediately after getting my master's, probably would have gotten something in communications or something along those lines, which I don't need those conversations anymore. I've got 2 degrees in media. There's not that much that I haven't
Sure.
already been exposed to. There's not a whole lot of learning that would go on there.
Yeah.
Nerdy conversations, yes. Learning, not necessarily. But then I took, 12 years off? Well, yeah, about 12 years between my master's and my starting a PhD program. And within that, I worked in after-school programming, first just from a, youth media perspective, teaching film to young people in an
Yeah.
after-school setting,
Yeah.
and then a more traditional after-school program with refugee and immigrants, as well
Uh-huh.
since you were my boss
Yeah.
for that.
I may have seen parts of that.
Yeah. You were slightly exposed to it. But because of those experiences and realizing, how impactful education can be and how rigid people's thoughts of what education is, I decided to go and get a PhD in education.
Okay.
And I'm the only person from an after-school background in any of my classes.
Mm.
And I'm in an educational leadership and policy course, so it's not even like just primarily talking about issues of diversity and things of that nature, which there are other education programs
Sure.
that are. I'm in classes with counselors and principals and, school administrators. And then there's this weird tattooed artist, filmmaker, after-school program guy.
Yeah.
But I have a lot of really interesting conversations with people because I represent a different viewpoint. It's not because I'm smart. It's because I come from a different background. And so I do see a lot of the flaws in the educational system and how that relates to both people who have mental health struggles, because that's another one of my focuses,
Sure.
or people who come from refugee and immigrant backgrounds because of experiences with students. You know, I just come from a different mindset and a different set of experiences. And so it's become this really interesting thing.
Yeah.
And while I'm not working on my dissertation yet, it will most likely have to do with media literacy,
Yeah.
which is another aspect that we still don't really talk about in schools very much, which is weird. Like most
Right.
high schools have photography and film and things of that nature, but we don't teach media literacy the same way that we teach literacy.
Right.
And most people aren't getting the majority of their information from traditional sources like books,
Yeah.
right? So yes, it's really important to learn how to read, but it's
Right.
also really important to learn how to read media, which
Yeah.
doesn't just combine information and words. It combines information with sound and with images and with psychological aspects of editing and all of these things. So you can really steer people a lot more through media. And we were already talking about, the funnel
Yeah.
that like social media can bring you down. So I think it's really important that we start teaching media literacy alongside with normal literacy,
For sure.
because we're getting more and more and more and more impact from media on a daily basis. So
Right.
we need to learn from an early age how to mitigate the damage there, but also how to use it for its strengths.
Yeah. I I really like to hear that there's people like you going out there and doing this, because I think about how much media has impacted me in my mental health when I'm a quote unquote fully grown adult, and it's quite substantial. And then you compare that to a kid or a young teenager that's really going through those developmental stages, and that's got to be a lot to deal with. I can't imagine being in junior high or high school with the technology that we have now, a phone in my pocket all the time, this constant comparison via social media, this constant like looking at social media to think that I need to be doing something better, being something more. That seems really exhausting.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting studies that have come out. I'm not one of those guys who can be like, hey, there's this study by these people. I'm a summarizer.
Yeah, I like that.
I live with a person who remembers everything she ever read. I am not that person. But I was reading a very interesting study, or a summary of a study, that shows that, when people who are that age, middle school, things of that nature, when they have the habit of going down rabbit holes on the internet, clicking on a thing and
Yeah.
reading something, or whether they came from social media or whatever, doing that constantly changes the way your brain develops. And so the areas of your brain that allow you to make, to judge whether something is true or not, basically, that gets underdeveloped.
Right.
And so if we think about how impactful, social media has been in the last few political cycles,
Yeah.
imagine 20 years from now when it's people who grew up with that, and
Right.
then just those parts of their brain that can critically think about whether something is accurate or not might be slightly underdeveloped.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying thought.
It's very terrifying, and that's why maybe the word psyop has been a big word lately. Is that like what kind of psychological operations are different political factions, just different groups in general? What are they doing to really influence how we think and how we interact with each other?
And then even things that, we think are relatively harmless, I guess, like advertisement. Oh, but
Yeah.
if you want to know the possibilities of media, look at what advertisers have been doing since the dawn of advertising.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Which is crazy to think about, because I used to think that these sort of advertisements didn't really affect me, but like, of course, everything you consume affects you at some level.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at anything from body image to, well, that's like the main one that people talk about, But then also that's an aspect that we always see stories about body image when it comes to women. And yes, there's a major issue there, but there's also body image when it comes to young men growing up. But we don't talk about that because we're taught that that's not something that we're supposed to examine.
Right.
Or we're not supposed to care about. But you still get the same barrage of images. And so it affects people on multiple different fronts, the things that you should be after. What does success look like? What does failure look like? What is a normal, quote unquote, person? How far off from that norm are you? Advertising really kind of creates this moving target of what those things are.
Yeah.
And so whenever I teach like a media class, I always have at least one part like, here's some advertising tricks that are used
Yeah.
against you. Is it a sense of belonging? Is it a sense of fear?
Uh,
Is it, any
Yeah.
one of these 7, 12, 25, depending on what list you look at. But there's some constant things,
Yeah.
right?
And then this obviously quickly ties into that passion that you spoke about, of this mental health sort of aspect of it, of how much it's affecting our mental health. So, like when a young boy doesn't fit into the stereotypes that they see in the social media, how's that having an effect? Or if a young woman is viewing things about body image, and how's that going to affect their mental health and that development at such a crucial time in their life, right?
Right. And, clearly I'm all about education. But
No,
same thing I
yeah,
said about media, right?
right.
I think that's a harder push,
Yeah.
is to actually get educational systems to recognize how important media is just from a literacy perspective.
Right.
Not just, oh, you need to learn how to do a website. Yeah, that's important because,
Right.
printing off a resume is not a thing that's going to last for much longer.
Sure.
You've got to know how to put together a little kind of CV website type thing
Right.
that you can send people to. But what I think we could push for more alongside health education, physical education, is mental health education, right? Because that's something that
Yeah.
I'd never had those conversations growing up. And
Yeah.
again, not from Utah, so I had actual sex ed in 5th and 6th grade.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, like 5th grade was maturation. 6th grade was here's how to prevent STDs and STIs, and it's not just abstinence.
Yeah, my maturation was, this is deodorant. It goes under your armpit.
Yeah.
That's it.
Great.
Yeah.
I mean, that's important.
Yeah.
That's important for social.
I didn't
things,
stink, but I didn't know anything about
didn't,
sex.
Didn't know anything else. Any of the things that you, were fighting
Right.
your instincts
Yeah.
for. But like, I don't know, I have any information.
Yeah.
So, but didn't talk about mental health.
Mm.
Right. The only times I ever talked about mental health was when I took like psychology class in high school, and that was always from a very deficit. Here's what is wrong with this person perspective, not a reckoning that all of us have mental health struggles.
Sure.
And all of us. Sometimes they're situational. Sometimes they're lifelong. Sometimes there's things that you could do to mediate. Sometimes there might not be. But just like having that conversation from a young age is, I think, a vitally important thing. That's the other focus of my stuff. So
I love that you're tying those two things in together, because I'm right there with you. I think they're super, super important. I do wish that eventually our educational system will have classes that are mandatory that talk about social, emotional, mental health, and how to talk about it and to normalize talking about it. Because if we don't do that, obviously with the way media is and the world we live in today, these mental health issues are just going to grow bigger and bigger.
Yeah, because it's harder and harder to escape them.
Right.
As well. But,
Yeah. There's almost some sort of comparison to like the American diet and how, there's a skyrocket of diabetes because we're eating all kinds of processed shit and sugar. It's like there's going to be a skyrocket of equal mental health challenges because there's a skyrocket of, all this social media stuff that we're talking about.
And the same problem with diabetes is also mental health too.
Well, yeah,
right. Like what you eat, it does have a huge difference in your chemical levels in your brain and things of that nature, and your ability to rest or not rest, or all of those things come together. And again, it's super complicated.
Right.
You grew up with like, here's the food pyramid, simplify everything, but it ain't that simple. Right. There's a lot of other things in there.
Right. Yeah.
And mental health is the same way, and media is the same way, and all of these topics that we try to like oversimplify. I understand why,
right?
Because you can't, again, talk about everything,
right?
But some of them we need to like recognize that they're more complicated.
Yeah.
And when I teach some of my courses, I'm always like, okay, we're today, because I teach a diversity course, which is weird because I'm very white, but. That's a whole other story. I feel like diversity courses are for white students to have to reckon with some of the realities that we have not.
Sure.
They're not for students of color who've experienced these things their whole lives.
Sure.
So when a white dude stands in front of a class and says, yeah, racism is a thing, white privilege is a thing, the white dude at the back of the class can't as easily push it off
Right.
because I have no reason to claim that.
Yeah.
If people recognize that, then that affects me in the power hierarchy.
Sure.
But when I'm teaching very complicated concepts in that course, like race or like, you know, gender issues, sexuality, things of that nature, I always have the caveat of like, okay, I'm going to give you a 30-minute chat about this. That is not even scratching the surface. I'm
Right.
just giving you some examples of things that highlight how this is reflected in daily life. This is not where the education ends. This is hopefully just to like get you to open your eyes a tiny bit, and then you start paying attention more.
Yeah.
So it's like everything else, if we expose people to some of these hard truths earlier on, maybe that will hopefully end up in the long haul helping
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. You would hope. I'm glad that connected the physical and mental health sort of aspects as well there, because I acknowledge that, and sometimes I even, as a quote unquote mental health professional, have forget to draw those connections and help people understand those connections. When I'm sitting across from clients or speaking to people about that, I do often try to like talk to them about like, well, what are you doing, in terms of your diet and your sleep and those sort of things, because it is going to affect your mental health and vice versa. So it's important for people to understand that there is at least a connection there, because I think maybe for a little while people were not acknowledging that, or that's not being talked about at all. So.
Yeah. And that's a real downer for somebody who has depression, like
Yeah.
me. You're like, oh, I know if I just stand up and do some exercise or whatever, it'll make me feel better. But then you still have to get up. That's the hard part.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then after the second day, it's way harder than the first day. And after the third day, you're just like, wow, someone's going to have to pry me out of this couch. So I try not to let it go more than a day.
Which is which you brought in that third factor maybe is that, asking for help or involving other people in your journey is super important in all aspects, whether it's you're trying to clean up your diet, whether it's you're trying to exercise, whether you're trying to process depression, involving somebody else is helpful.
Yeah, and that's where building these social, I guess, normalities of having conversation would be an important thing, right? We always talk in mental health about lifting stigma. And it's not just to make the people who clearly have mental health struggles feel better. It's so that everybody can admit, hey, today, I don't know why, but I'm super stressed out. Or today, I'm very anxious.
Right.
Something happened, and now I really don't have the motivation to do stuff. Those are terrifying things to say.
Right.
Right. Like if you have a job and you tell your boss, hey, I'm having a lot of anxiety today, so I'm not going to be very efficient. A lot of people feel like, I'm going to get fired for saying that.
Yeah.
If you say, hey, I've got the flu, I'm not coming in today because I'm going to throw up on everybody.
Right.
People are like, all right, cool. Got it. Don't come in.
Yeah.
But mental health, you still can't talk about that. So there's a long way to go to make those conversations. Because, if I could just say, if I didn't feel bad about admitting, I'm having a hard time getting off the couch today, I could probably talk to somebody about it, and then they might say, all right, well, come do this.
Right.
And pull me off.
Right.
Which doesn't always work.
Yeah.
But just saying,
for sure.
Baby steps to get to that point where we can actually have these larger social conversations. And again, I'm focusing on mental health or media because those are areas that I work in, or art because those are areas that I work, but anything.
Yeah.
That's the case,
Well, yeah, and if we experience that shift as individuals, then hopefully we'll see that shift as a community, and then the way we treat each other and talk to each other in the community around all these topics becomes easier, more friendly, more caring, more understanding. We're quickly seeing people for who they are rather than just, I don't know, seeing somebody as an employee that does work for me or whatever it might be.
Right.
Yeah. Which, I think me and you could probably, just preach into the choir, but I think it's important to verbalize and talk about these things at this level so that other people can hear this perspective or hear different perspectives.
And I think it's also really important, because a lot of times, again, when you have these conversations, I already talked about performative aspects of all these things. I'm not saying I'm performing, but I know what to say.
Yeah.
You know, I know what is acceptable to say, what is not acceptable to say, and in certain moments in my life, am I always this perfectly empathetic person? Of course not.
Absolutely
Of
not.
course
Yeah.
not. But it's important to recognize, hey, all right, that I should have done better,
Mm,
and I could have done better.
right.
Realizing that even if you're one of the people who's on the forefront, which I'm not saying I'm on the forefront, but even if you are one of these people who's held up as a model in whatever capacity,
Mm,
you have to recognize that you still screw up a lot,
sure.
that you still ostracize people, that you still refuse to give somebody the time of day because of whatever,
Right.
because they either, come from a world that you don't really want to inhabit or because you're having a bad day or what have you. It's really important for all of us to say, okay, even though I'm trying and I'm doing all these things, I definitely am not perfect. And
Right.
there's definitely still things that I can improve on,
Yeah.
and that's the hardest thing.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
I'm with you. I'm there all the time, like thinking, like, of course, there's still room for me to grow and expand in different areas and to push myself, and but also recognizing that I need to tell myself to take a rest. Like, I don't need to do everything every day. You know, there's one day where it's probably best for me to just not do anything.
yeah, and that's also really hard, right?
Right.
Because if you have one platform that you really care about, which most people have far more than one
Sure.
thing that they really care about. But if you have one platform that you care about and you still see things not being accomplished, there's this drive to continue to work and to wear yourself out. And that doesn't really end up helping
Yeah.
in the long haul, which is why we have to start again. It's social movements. It's not individual things. Yes, we can all do individual things, but until we make that more of an actual social movement where if I take a day off, there's somebody right behind me who can keep working.
Mm.
That's not the case. Nothing gets done.
Yeah.
The people who try real hard burn out, and then,
Right.
who knows what happens.
Right.
So, again, it's complicated. I
It
think
is.
that's the theme of the conversation today. Everything's way more complicated than we make it out to be.
Complicated and complex, and part of this journey for me is to be comfortable with the complexity of life. Right, it's a complex thing to go through every day. There's so many different variables, so many different factors, so many different things happening. So understanding how that's going to affect the physical, mental, emotional part of my life.
And like you were saying, knowing when to say, that is not mine,
Yeah.
right? Which is a hard thing
Right.
to say, I don't know what to do here.
Right.
If you're somebody who has learned to care and has learned to try to help people, you always try to help them through everything.
Right.
And again, being a member of this creativity and mental health organization, I occasionally get text messages and stuff of somebody who's having something. And I'm always, well, do I try my best to talk to them? I'm not a therapist.
Sure.
It's not who I am.
Sure.
So I've taken to I have this page of here's people that you can talk to.
Right.
Here's organizations that are there. Here's options for you.
Right.
If you want somebody to hang out with you, I'm there. But if you
Right.
want somebody to do therapy, that can't be me.
Yeah.
It's not who I am.
Yeah, and I think that's like just saying those sort of things to those that we interact with and saying like, "Hey, you recognize that I am or I'm not a mental health therapist, so I'm happy to sit here with you and just chat and help you with whatever situation. But just know that I have my own limitations. But let's talk.
Right.
Yeah,
But tricky thing.
it is tricky. It is. I mean, none of these things are easy. But I think my experience has been that as I've pushed myself to like just be more vulnerable and open about certain things and push myself to talk to people about these things, they have come back to me and say like, oh, that was really helpful. Thanks for saying that. I was feeling that too. I didn't want to say it or I didn't know how to say it, but you brought it up and opened up the door sort of thing, and so we were able to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it all comes down to, again, pulling it back to education. I was lucky enough to have some teachers that when you ask a question, instead of them making up some bullshit or saying that's not important, they would be like, well, I don't know.
Or lying to you.
Or lying to you. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question. And back, I'm old enough to like, I'll look into that and get to you tomorrow. Now it's just, hey, Google.
Yeah.
Let's find out.
Yeah, let's Google this.
Yeah, but just having that person who's this authority who is supposed to be someone who is the quote unquote all knowing in the room, or at least the person who is leading the education say, I don't know.
Right.
makes it okay to recognize, oh, well, there's things I don't know.
Right.
I'm learning, and this person who's teaching me is still learning.
Right.
I think that's always helpful.
Yeah, the power of I don't know and the power of like, hey man, I fucked up.
Yeah.
That's like
Yeah.
I think that
Or I'm terrible at this thing,
Yeah.
and I know I'm not going to be able to do it.
I made this mistake. Like just saying that, people that immediately like puts people at ease and be like, okay, he's admitting he made a mistake. I get it because I make mistakes too. So let's just work through this together, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a good step. It's a good starting point.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about mental health fit, FIT?
Sure. FIT.
Yeah.
I have to remember what FIT stands for. It's Films, Ideas, and Technology, I believe.
Okay.
Films, Ideas, something. Sorry, we've changed the name many times.
You've grown, expanded.
Yeah, we've expanded, and we try to reflect what it is. So I'm the technical director. It basically means I am the person who helps make things come to fruition.
Okay.
So there's two of us that are really involved. Brian Higgins is the person who founded it, and he has done all sorts of interesting things in the Salt Lake film community, from running the 48-hour film project for the last, 10 years, probably more. Lots of other small local film festivals, things of that nature. He's a storyteller and he's performed with lots of his own stuff, and he has a really hard background mentally. It's not my job to talk about him, but he's very honest and open about it.
Right.
So if you look him up, you're going to find him talking honestly about
maybe
stuff.
A future guest.
Maybe he'll talk to you, no problem. But so he started this thing, which is trying to use film. Back in the day, it was just film to lift stigma in mental health conversations. Okay. And then it's taken a couple of turns. I got really involved a few years ago, just helping him shoot some things, film some things, and edit those together. And then we had more conversations. And then when he wanted to expand it, he brought me on in a little bit even more of a conversational role.
Yeah.
And so right before COVID hit, we were trying to do more educational-based things where we could go do presentations to companies or people or what have you, just to give the bare bones. Here's mental health things that you can think about.
Sure.
Just to combat what people don't know or the falsities,
right?
The myths that aren't really true. But now we've dialed it back again a little bit, and we're just doing more, again, creative stuff. So Brian is still very focused on the film aspects because media is so, right? Media is an impactful thing if you get people to watch it, and it can live out there for a long time as opposed to a play or something else that happens once.
Right.
If you make a cute little documentary and you spread it around, that's an easy thing for people to watch and get a little bit out of. So he runs... We get a lot of grants, and we do little short projects, one-off projects. We also do little film festivals and stuff. So we just finished a cute little interactive film festival called See It This Way, where he curated it, and then we made a couple of pieces for it, and it was sort of an interactive walk through this space and pick what your experience is going to be. Do you want to go look at these things? Do you want to go look at these? Do you want to watch a whole movie? Do you want to watch a short? Do you want to learn about myths? Do you want to whatever, right? So there's a bunch of different things that you can do there, and we're working on another one that's going to launch in June that's going to have an online component, but also an in-person component that's mental health film festival called Labeled. So we do a lot of these things, and we're trying to always do more projects in various forms, and then I try to bring in more other forms of art into it as well. So
very cool,
because I think that art, not just media, but all forms of art, are a way that we can have conversations that you're not used to having.
Yeah.
Has its own stumbling blocks.
Right.
Because once you get to a certain age, people say, we're going to make some art. You're either totally for it or you're like, oh, I'm not an artist.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if you can't even draw a stick figure. If you take some paint and you smear it around, you say, what colors represent something?
Right.
There's a different part of your brain that's activated. And even if it's just like a meditative thing for 10 minutes, that's helpful. If you're feeling real stressed out and you just doodle or scratch designs into something, probably not a desk. I'm not going to encourage vandalism necessarily. If you own it, go for it.
Sure.
It is a different part of your brain.
Yeah.
I've started a documentary many times I've never finished it, examining the link between artists and depression or depressive, disorders, because there's a whole umbrella, whether it's
Yeah.
bipolar or just depression or
Right.
PTSD or
Right.
all these things. Like, does having mental health struggles make you more creative, or does being more creative make you more susceptible to mental health struggles? And so along those lines, a few years ago, there was a researcher up at the university who was doing brain imaging as people were doing art. And he noticed the same areas of the brain that light up when you're doing physical exercise light up when you're doing art.
Oh, interesting.
So, we've always heard, oh, yeah, a good way to combat mental health struggles is go out and do some exercise. But you get the same brain effects to a degree, just doodling,
Right.
doing some finger paints, whatever, man.
Yeah. Doing art.
So that's my other thing, is trying to bring more people into doing silly little art things.
Yeah.
And then we usually film it and then have them reflect on it. So it's still a film, but it's a different aspect.
So all this again with the overall goal of kind of just lifting mental health stigma, a little bit more awareness about it being out there, and maybe some tools on how to
Yeah,
to
some
combat it.
simple tools to get you through those moments, connecting people with resources, normalizing conversations. I
Yeah.
think those are the big ones.
Yeah, I really like that, and I think that if most people were to be honest with themselves, everybody's interested in like film and being a part of a film at some level, because we all grew up watching films and
Yeah,
love
even if
films
it's just
and
watching a movie.
right.
We all know how to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
I got a certain mood. I want to watch an action movie. Another
Yeah.
one, I'm going to watch this thing. I really don't feel like Tarantino
Right.
today, which is my normal day. I usually don't feel like that. It's very rare that I feel like a Tarantino movie, but occasionally it happens.
Right.
So whether it's making one or just experiencing one or using it as a window to have real conversations, and that's the real fun part about these film festivals, when they happen in person.
Right.
Because we usually partner with Alliance House, is an organization in town that really does a lot of good work with people who have, stronger mental health struggles that stop them from doing some aspect of their life. And they have
Right.
lots of different programs that help with housing and food and work and things of that nature. And every year for the past 3 or 4 years, we've done a film with them where it's members there, they're telling their story or part of their story, and then they're up on the screen for a few minutes.
Right.
But then afterwards, the amount of people in the crowd who come and just talk to that person, or who say, hey, I've been through something similar.
Right.
There's so many people that are out there that have never had that outlet just to say, hey, me too.
Yeah.
Or, hey,
Yeah.
this makes a little more sense now.
Right.
So again, that's using media. It all comes
Right.
back together, right? That's using
Yeah.
arts and media and mental health in a way to kind of bridge these conversations.
Yeah. And just speaking from me participating in one of the last films that you guys did, working with refugee youth and getting them to share their story and their perspective on mental health, I think that it's such a huge thing for somebody to be able to watch that, and to watch youth in particular be vulnerable about what they're going through, and to hear their struggles. And I mean, most people will be able to relate to that at some level. I think that's such a big thing.
Yeah, and I think, another majorly important part about it is we're not always saying the same thing.
Mm.
It's not the same PSA that we've
Right.
seen forever. About, this is what depression is like. This is what it's realizing that even if you have the same diagnosis as somebody, or if you don't have any kind of diagnosis, that doesn't mean you don't experience these things.
Right.
And your experience might be vastly different than somebody else.
Right.
Right. And also that piece that you were talking about that aired locally on PBS, pretty cute. Again, they did an art project that was reflecting on mental health. Not all of the youth involved have diagnosed mental health
Right.
issues. In fact, only one that I know of does, and
Yeah.
really shared that. But all of them could talk about how mental health is really important, whether there's somebody who has a mental illness or who just suffers from
Mhm.
day-to-day struggles with mental health stuff. And obviously, if you come from a refugee background, there's a lot more trauma involved. Whether you actually physically experienced that trauma or it was just throughout your family, that changes
Yeah.
the way you experience some things. So, it's a more, I don't know if I can say it's a more prone subset of our society that most likely has to deal with mental health issues, because I think we all do. But
Right.
even if you're somebody who doesn't identify as, I have a mental illness, reflecting on it in some capacity is really helpful.
For sure.
So out of the four participants, Yeah, the four main participants, only one of them really talked about this is my mental health struggle.
Yeah.
And the rest were a lot more generic in terms. But over the course of that project, you actually saw two of them reflect a lot more. And I'd known these students for years.
Yeah.
And I learned more about some of their mental health struggles
Yeah. Same with me.
in those 2 days of filming and editing and reflecting than I did in years of everyday conversation. So,
That brings up an interesting thought or point that I kind of wanted to ask you about in terms of using, in particular, film as an avenue to get this message out there, to educate. Because it feels like to me, and you can obviously, you have more experience and can speak to this, but it feels like when you put somebody in front of the camera and give them sometimes literally a microphone and literally this opportunity to tell their story, knowing that it's going to be in a film, it does kind of feel like in some level permission to open up a little bit more, permission to like, okay, it's my opportunity to tell my story and I know that me telling my story is going to help somebody else that's going to view this. So that as an avenue really helps people with, all of that.
well, yeah. And I think it's a different situation.
Mm.
You know, I don't think the average human being has been the subject of a documentary.
Yeah.
Probably.
True.
I've been on both sides of the camera many times just because of the world that I inhabit and the
Right.
things that I do. So to me, it's very normal to be here talking in a microphone or have the camera pointed at me.
Right.
It's more normal for me to be pointing the camera at somebody else.
Yeah.
But, that changes things, And for some people, it's terrifying, and they're not going to do it. But that's why oftentimes when we do these, especially with youth, I wanted it to be more of a community project. It was not just, I'm going to talk to this youth and get their story, and they make a thing, and then separately this person, and they make it separately. So that's why we got together, and we just did some silly little activities first to create our own cute little community, to have conversations about mental health where I shared stuff about my own struggles before ever asking them to really reflect on their own or anything. And that creates this other, again, new community of people who are like, hey, if I'm feeling something, if I'm saying something, if I'm thinking something, I can talk about it here.
Yeah.
And with that as a foundation, we got some really interesting stuff. I think it would have been a very different piece if we just said, hey, here, you sit down in this room, I'm going to interview you.
Good points. Yeah.
They would have probably given you the same kind of canned answers because there wasn't that real give and take of conversation and thought and reflection.
Yeah. So you as, I don't know, is that considered a producer sort of role?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I'm doing these things, I like to think of myself as a facilitator.
Okay.
But yes, it would be kind of the producer. I shared producing credit on that because while I didn't deal with the main client who had the confines of what we had to do, I took those ideas that we got the green light on, and then I found participants, and I scheduled all of that, and then I, worked with them.
And set up this sort of structure outline that you probably thought in advance about, saying like, if we do this, it might help them feel more comfortable to open up, sort of thing.
Yeah, well, and also give them a lot of input on the project because that's another thing that you see a lot, especially working with refugee students. You have this tokenized idea where their English teacher, the entire time they're here, they have one topic that they really want to hear about, and it's their sad refugee story. You're white kid from Park City in the classroom. Nobody says you have to tell your sad immigration story. But if you are an immigrant or a refugee, that's like, that's all people want to hear about, and you become tokenized as this one thing. So that's why when I'm working with, especially a marginalized population, which primarily is refugee students, because that's my, those are the people I know.
Right.
It's really important to give them, and give is a hard term, encourage a sense of ownership, encourage a sense of, actual participation in what the project looks like.
Sure.
So again, these art projects, this film, I could have said, we're all going to do this.
Right.
And we're going to talk about this. Here's the questions. We didn't do that, right? We had more actual conversations, and the other students were there, and they asked a couple of questions in some of the interviews when we could have them more than two people there at a time because it was still during COVID. So, but then they all chose what kind of project they were going to do, what they were going to say with that project, what they were comfortable with or not comfortable with, and reflecting in their own mental health. And, if we took those same four students now and did another one, it would probably be even better
Right.
because they've already gone through that experience once.
Yeah.
And so now they would reflect differently and they'd be like, all right, what did I do last time? How can I do something even stronger? And so the
Right.
4 pieces that were made were all very different.
Yeah.
And they said very different things and they reflected on very different topics within this large, that's a microphone, within these larger umbrellas. I'm a hand talker. Now everybody knows that. I've somehow managed to not hit it the entire time.
Yeah.
But there you go. So that's a really important part, right?
Right.
Is making sure that when you're working with people, you don't just dictate what they're going to say.
Yeah.
And you don't have these preconceived notions of what they're going to share or not. You have to
Right.
give them. It's a lot harder.
Right.
It's much harder to have a project like that where the
Yeah.
participants have a lot of say in what it's going to look like because you can't plan as well. I did a lot of runs to Michael's and things of that nature the night before because I'd ask questions like, okay, what do you need? This or this? And they change your mind. Oh, okay, that, got it. And then I would bring a couple extra things and say, okay, this is what you said you wanted, but here's some other options if you want to try something.
Yeah.
You know, because that opens that line of thought and that
Right.
opens the possibilities. And then people's brains are in a different space, and then you get different reactions and you get different, more honest interactions. I think so.
If anybody in the community wanted to get involved with the organization or participate in the organization, what would that look like?
So there's lots of different ways. You know, I mean, obviously we're a nonprofit, so there's funding is
Money.
important.
Yeah, I have a little bit of experience with
Yeah,
nonprofits,
yeah,
so
which is
any
the-
money
yeah,
that can be given
That's
is
the worst
definitely
aspect
a
of
good
nonprofit
thing.
because we also
Yeah.
never charge anybody.
Sure.
You know, for I mean, when we do film festivals and stuff, most of them are not charged. We always try to figure out ways that we can charge people for something just to bring in money, but we don't want to push somebody away because they can't.
Right.
So most of the mental health film festivals are actually free. Like the things that we do online, they're free. The Labeled Fest, it's free. Occasionally we'll do something just to raise funds, but usually there's a way to get it for free
Right.
as well. So you can always figure out ways to fund things.
Yeah.
Again, there are a lot of opportunities that come up, whether it's an online film festival or a in-person film festival. That's probably the best way to really experience what's going on. Because, whenever you're like, hey, volunteer, you'll get 30 people who say, I want to volunteer, and only one of them is actually going to probably do something
Yeah.
sometimes or fall off. And the other thing that that's super important, I'm always looking for more people who are willing to share their stories because we've been
Yeah.
doing these for years now.
Sure.
And I'm tired of telling my story. I'm tired of filming Brian tell his story.
Yeah.
And we already have multiple examples of that.
Right.
And my really close friends that I know of that I know
Yeah.
are willing to share their stories. I've hit them up once or twice already. So we need other people from different walks of life, especially who are willing to say, hey, okay, I'll talk about this. This is
Right.
the struggle that I have. And I want to collect a whole bunch of little micro docs so that moving forward, when we have a film festival, in between the longer films, we can have a 2 or 3 minute thing of somebody saying, hey, this is my story. This is what I deal with. This is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Because the more people that we can have from different walks of life who actually share those stories, that's how you normalize it,
Yeah.
right? This
For
is not
sure.
what depression looks like. Here's
For sure.
can look like anything.
Yeah.
And then, yes, there are other opportunities as
Right.
well that come up from time to time. So just go to the website, mentalhealthyfit.org, and you can find out more about the organization. You can see what events are coming up. There's a lot of films and resources that are already on there
Yeah.
as well. And then you can always just reach out.
There you go.
The contact information is there.
Yeah. I think this is a topic that's probably on a lot of people's minds lately, more so than in the past. So, yeah, I think if you hear this and you want to get involved, certainly do it.
Yeah,
Contact
just reach
Josh
out.
and Brian and get involved and tell your story. It's going to help somebody else for sure.
And if you're really friends with anybody who has very deep pockets
We like that. Yeah.
and wants to fund more things, great.
Yeah.
Because we also do this. Neither one of us is this our full-time gig,
Right.
right? I have lots of hats. Brian has several hats as
Yeah.
well. And we still accomplish a lot of different things. We still have a lot of things that go on over the course of the year. But if we could actually just make this our normal gig, I feel like we could have a
Yeah.
much faster impact and could have even more things going on. So, but again, that's a silly funding thing that every nonprofit deals with.
Yeah, it's definitely the number one challenge, but yeah, no harm in asking, and hopefully
That's right. There you
somebody
go.
answers the call, right?
If you shake your couch cushions and $500,000 shows up,
Yeah.
reach on out.
Let's
We'll
do
figure out
some
something cool to
projects.
do with it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, on sort of that community level, and we can even tie this back into the Salt Lake community that's so influenced by the Mormon Church. What's the responsibility of the community in Salt Lake's case with community in the church? What's the responsibility in terms of mental health and promoting mental health and taking care of mental health with its community members?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. I think yeah, we actually have made some strides as a community.
Yeah, I agree.
How effective some of those strides will be, I don't know. I feel like we're on a precipice that we can either continue the conversations going forward, because as long as I've been alive, you only really talk about mental health when there's a tragedy or somebody that
It's true.
either dies by suicide or a celebrity dies by suicide or something along those lines. You also notice I say dies by as opposed to commits,
Right.
because that's another thing the simple thing you can do, right?
Yeah.
You commit a crime. So you
Right.
say somebody commits suicide, that's
Yeah.
blaming language. That's not, so
Yeah.
little things like that, just
Yeah, I like
realizing,
that.
okay,
Yeah, I really like that.
that's when we talk about it. But I feel like we've talked about it a little bit more over the
Mm.
last 10 years
Sure.
or so, which is the first time that I can remember it being something that still bubbles up,
Right.
And so that's, I think, a good sign. So we're getting there. We just have to keep the conversation going. And again, we have to move that conversation beyond the simple PSA of what mental health is and reflect that we all have mental health struggles.
Yeah.
And I think that really comes from the people who are in the public light, because we also reach out to people just to talk about the importance of mental health in the community. And sometimes it's really hard to find somebody who's in the public light just to say, yes, we should all talk about mental health more,
Yeah,
because
it's true.
it's terrifying.
Right.
There are some celebrities that actually have talked about it, but usually they're people who have enough money, they don't have to worry about anything anymore. It's much scarier for the rest of us to talk about these things.
Yeah.
So as a community, we have to figure out those ways to do that. And it comes from legislation, it comes from education, it comes from, just being more open and honest and finding those new avenues to normalize things.
God forbid we have to be honest with each
I
other.
know. And like I said, we've had some legislation this last year. The Utah legislature, which I very rarely agree with, which you probably picked up on, they passed a mental health day
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
change to so that a student in Utah schools can use mental health as a valid excuse for an absence. And then when you combine that with another bill that passed this year, that you don't need a doctor's note to have an excused medical, quote unquote, absence, those two things are really important.
Yeah.
Right? Because now if you're a student in Utah, technically speaking, I don't know how well it's going to work,
Yeah.
but legally speaking, you can say, hey, I'm super stressed out today. I can't come to school.
Yeah.
And you don't need a note that
Yeah.
says that you have a mental illness.
Right.
And the real conversation around that bill was the difference between a mental illness and mental health
Yeah.
in the legislature from Representative Winder and the people who spoke out about it. So that's a good thing moving forward.
Step in the right direction. for
Again,
sure.
in action, how much is it going to change? I don't know. But just the fact that passed is a good thing. The fact that our newer governor, who I also very rarely agree with, is willing to say when he was younger he had suicidal ideation. And he's done that multiple times, not just once. It wasn't just a slip up.
Right.
We've interviewed him for Mental Healthy Fit before, where he
Right.
talked about that, and he talked about the importance of talking to young people about mental health and providing resources and finding more funding for those resources. So we do have, even in this super conservative legislation or governmental Utah government, we do see some shifts in mental health.
Yeah.
And so I think continuing to ask for those and push for those, because it's not as challenging as it once was, apparently,
Yeah.
which is nice.
Yeah.
Unlike a lot of other issues that are still somehow very challenging. Seems to be one that actually, and that the reasons for that are sad.
Right.
When you want to throw around statistics about, suicide rate in Utah and things of that nature. Coming in 51st in the nation.
Yeah, which is important for people to know and understand. Yeah.
So there are some social shifts coming from relatively unexpected places, I guess.
Yeah,
So we all just have to keep those moving forward.
for sure. Yeah, I like that. Can we digress for a second?
Yeah.
So, a real topic of interest apart from these very important ones that we've been talking about today is maybe less important depending on who you talk to. But aliens and UFOs have been in the news a lot lately.
Yes, they have.
And so I'm always interested to hear like what people's thoughts and just general perspectives are, because I grew up with a father that was fairly interested in it and talked about it a decent amount, and we would kind of like, you know, say some things about it, but we would never go too in depth. But now these days it's in the news a lot. People are talking about it more. I want to hear what Josh.
Just hear what I think.
Yeah, what has Josh?
Which Josh is going to answer this question? That's the real question.
The honest one.
Well, they're all honest, Peter. It just depends
okay
on which
if-
personality comes out.
It's okay if you think it's all bullshit, because I want to hear that, because like I need some challenge to like my like.
Yeah,
Like, oh,
no.
it's so cool that there's aliens.
Again, I'm from the Show Me State, and what the Show Me State means is calling bullshit
Yeah,
on things. It's like,
yeah.
I don't believe it unless I've seen it.
Yeah.
I've never seen an alien. I've never seen a UFO. Does that mean they don't exist? I don't know. It's the same thing as like, I haven't experienced it, but that doesn't mean it's not a valid experience, right?
Right.
Are there things that fly around that government planes have not known what they are? Yes.
Mm.
Are they spacecraft? Are they ball lightning? Are they some weird atmospheric phenomenon? I don't know.
Yeah.
I've watched my cats chase all sorts of weird things on the walls that are just a reflection. And, we like to think we're way smarter than cats, but we're not.
Yeah.
We
It's a valid
have to
point.
work for a living.
Yeah.
Our cats do not. So
Yeah.
our cats officially are smarter than the rest of us.
And we both chase weird lights.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to rule everything out, but I also have never seen anything that really convinces me
Mm.
that aliens, the way that we like to imagine them, exist
Right.
the way they do. Is there other life outside of there? Of course there is. I'm not a religious person.
Mm.
I do not believe in that people are like the magical thing in the universe. No, right? We're a
We're
form of
top of
life
the top.
that happened to evolve to where we are. I'm sure there's a lot better ones out there. Like I said, cats better than us. So
I don't know if I can agree with
even
you
on
that.
Earth, there are animals that are better than us.
Yeah.
So there is definitely some kind of life out there. Is it the life that we're looking for? Probably not,
Yeah.
because there's this egocentrism of humanity
Yeah.
where what we consider life or what we consider intelligence is based on how we understand life or
Yeah.
intelligence. So is there something else out there? Sure. Is it flying around
Yeah.
in spaceships? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say no, but I'm not going to say yes.
Yeah.
Same thing with like ghosts, right? I like to believe when I die, I just stop existing because that's kind of peaceful for somebody who has a depressive mind.
Sure.
Like, oh, I'm done. Cool.
Right.
No more. But am I still afraid of ghosts? A little bit.
Yeah.
When the lights are all off in a place I don't know, I'm like,
Yeah.
this could be the time that the ghost comes again. I've watched a lot of ghost shows. I've watched a lot of alien shows. I find it fascinating. I just don't know
You
really what to think about.
you run up the stairs from your basement
That's
really
right.
fast.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Done that many times.
Because the ghosts are behind
The
you.
ghost might be behind me. Yeah, I don't know.
I
Something like that.
certainly have done
Yeah.
that. Well, yeah, I appreciate you indulging me
Oh,
in the alien topic, because I've been going down plenty of alien rabbit holes lately, and I think it's an interesting topic, and it does quickly, for some people, it does quickly get to this sort of state of like talking about consciousness and what is consciousness and perspective of like, can we even like with the way our brains work, can we think about alternate ways of living and doing life and alternate forms of life in the universe? No, we don't know it all. So when you start talking about things that you can't see in front of you or hold in your hands, then it gets a little
It
weird.
gets a little weird.
Yeah.
There's always that fun little exercise where people talk about, oh, the whole world doesn't exist. It's just you, and you're part of an experiment. And I'm like, wow, that's shitty.
Yeah.
Like, this is a real asshole experiment.
Yeah,
if
I
that's
don't
the
like
case.
this. Yeah.
But am I going to say it's not possible? No. Maybe. Maybe all this is just somebody's experiment. Who knows?
Yeah. It's weird if it is. Yeah.
I know a lot of weird people, so I don't discount a lot of things.
Yeah. I mean,
Anymore.
me either. Like the fact that somebody else can make a giant experiment on a planet. I don't know.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as long as it doesn't hurt me,
Yeah.
believe whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly right.
Once you say you got to believe this, so you have to do this because it's that's where we have a problem.
Yeah.
But if you want to worship a rock, cool. As long
Yeah.
as you don't throw that rock in my head,
I'm with you.
I am totally down for it.
I'm with
so,
you.
and I feel like the same thing with aliens, right?
Yeah.
Am I intrigued by the concept? Yes. Do I know if they exist or not? No.
Yeah.
Which is already a strong stance.
Right.
Because
Right.
usually you're supposed to be like, yes or no. I'm like,
Right.
I don't know. Maybe.
Right.
Maybe not.
Could be. Yeah. Show me. Yeah. I get that.
I try to deal with the things that are right around me.
Yeah. It's
So-
enough to deal with, probably, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Maybe to wrap up, any like final like thoughts from Josh Samson to the community, like if you were to have, I don't know, a message, something you would want to convey, something you'd want people to take from this conversation.
I would say, we've talked about several of my passions and how I've
Yeah.
kind of mobilized those into actionable or attempted to be actionable things.
Sure.
That's something we all need to do
Mm.
a little bit more, right? You don't need to latch on to what other people tell you
Right.
is what you should care about. If there's something that's really important to you and you care about that thing, if it's aliens for you, Peter, go for it. Because that's what we need. We need to step outside of the little check boxes that are designed for us. And that's easier said than done. Again, this is where I can recognize privilege
Sure.
as well. We all have to eat. We all have to live somewhere. Some of us have an easier time finding those resources as others. But there are moments in your life where someone's going to tell you, this is who you have to be. And if that's not who you think you need to be, if that's not who you feel you should be, you got to do something about that.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's real hard, and sometimes it's actually pretty easy.
Right.
It just depends on the situation. So find the things that really make life worth living and go for those.
I like that.
Not just for yourself, though,
Right.
for other people, too.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that's a great message and a great way to wrap this up. So thanks.
Yay, you betcha.
All right.
Then you press stop. And then the fun part, chopping it down to whatever length you want it to be.
What do I push on this? The record button again? Oh, no, the stop button.